Assassin's Creed Origins, the 2017 title from everybody's favourite gaming battery farm, Ubisoft. This game was a huge turn in the Assassin's Creed brand's history, shifting onwards from more concise, cityscape-dominated open worlds filled with pointless collectibles and servicing shorter stories, to a full-blown 40-plus hour-long open-world role-playing game encompassing an entire country, a land of majesty and mystery. A controversial direction for Assassin's Creed that I may at the time have been an advocate for, which looking back was kind of my mistake, but we'll ignore that. But with respect to Origins, it made for a fleetingly rare, refreshing instance of an Assassin's Creed game. One I loved over 7 years ago when this game was new, and haven't played for a long time since, as the ACRPGs that followed it didn't capture what it meant to be Assassin's Creed just as painfully as they didn't really capture what it meant to be an RPG in the first place, and that honestly soured me. Well, the time has come to revisit this digital recreation of ancient Egypt for a fresh playthrough, and explore where AC Origins worked and where it didn't, to understand the game's intent, and now that I'm liberated from the Assassin's Creed churn, view it for what it was, not what it was trying to become, nor what it was trying to distance itself from, at least from a brand perspective, and try to answer one key question. Is it a good game? Let's find out.
He's been in the Preston Guildhall now since about 2018. But what's bothered to move it?
Now I can't think of a better place to begin than to talk about the setting. No good Assassin's Creed game is worth one's salt without a good setting, and Origins had a certified whopper. Prior to this game's very announcement, ancient Egypt was the pipe dream of any Assassin's Creed fan. That and feudal Japan, which is incidentally where Assassin's Creed Shadows is taking the series. Whether that will have the same fuck it effect of rejuvenation remains to be seen. Settings that sounded like a good idea were constantly cropping up in rumours and speculation, but never seemed like areas Ubisoft would touch. However, that changed when leaks and rumours began to circulate about an Assassin's Creed Empire. Whispers of the franchise going to ancient Egypt were met with excitement, and off the back of AC Unity and Syndicate, we all knew a big change was coming. A change that at the time seemed overdue, as Assassin's Creed's formula naturally ran a bit dry, or at least appeared to. Empire speculation ran rampant for well over a good year, and the fanbase grew rabid as Ubisoft finally took a much needed break from annual AC releases in 2016. And I mean, obviously the content well dried up because I made a speculation video about the game's glitches. What on earth possessed me? Of course, time dragged on as it always does, and then by mid-2017 we finally got to see it. Confirmation that Assassin's Creed was in fact daring the magical setting of ancient Egypt. Assassin's Creed Origins. Ashraf Ismail, the game director of Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag before it, bust onto the stage at E3 2017, back when E3 was a thing, and also back before anyone learned about the allegations that he was abusing his position at Ubisoft to hook up with fans, showing us what Ubisoft had been working on. And suddenly the heavily rumoured, much anticipated Assassin's Creed setting was very real, and only a matter of months away. Off the bat, the setting alone was beyond exciting. The possibilities of such a revered time and place, the mysteries it invoked, the spirituality, the culture, the very deserts themselves. AC Origins looked like it was going to deliver an instant classic as far as settings were concerned, and when it finally arrived and we all got to at long last play this much anticipated title, I won't pretend it didn't deliver. Ancient Egypt as a backdrop, though technically better defined as Ptolemaic Egypt or Hellenistic Egypt if you're feeling fanciful, but allow me some generalisation for the sake of concision, is absolutely top-notch. Perhaps one of Ubisoft's best ideas. From exploring the mysteries of the pyramids to simply undertaking an arduous journey across the desert, Egypt is utterly splendid as a baseline for this title. Better yet, being set in the year 49 BC, ancient Egypt was already pretty bloody ancient. This means that we had a firmly planted in our modern times and a foot planted in the past on display. As the game isn't trying to remove us from our biases, I think the best example is as follows. While from afar, the Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, might look nigh on brand spanking new, the closer you get, the older you realise it is. The end feeling is one of realisation of just how incomprehensibly old this land truly is. That fine limestone finish is slowly peeling away to reveal the pyramid we know today beneath, and if it was already fading over 2,000 years ago, how long ago was it actually constructed? This grants us a perspective of the impossible vintage of this marvel of human engineering. And as a bit of an interesting fact, the time period Assassin's Creed Origins is set in is actually closer to modern times than the time period estimated to be when these pyramids were constructed. So that means, provided those estimations are correct, you could double how far back in time you went, and these bloody things would still be there. So this feeling of being in an ancient world, one that was already immeasurably old to contemporaries, is one hell of a feeling to deliver. And I think this was the correct approach, as it provides this sense of familiarity as you can still rationalise Egypt as very, very, very old, and yet you're still somewhere a long, long time ago. It's this balance that makes this particular choice of time, the waning years of ancient Egypt as an overall civilization, quite spectacular. We got to explore it as a world millennia removed from our own times, yet allowing us dark tombs to explore filled with old secrets and cobwebs galore, our way illuminated only by the warm flame of our torches as we navigate ancient crevices hiding secrets that predate even them, on brand for Assassin's Creed. This placement in time also means we get a nice mashup of influences. Not only do we have Egyptian culture on display first and foremost, but ancient Greek and Roman cultures too, with the game being set at the final chapter of the Ptolemaic kingdom in the struggle between the last of the Greek Ptolemies, Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra VII, and how their contest for power invoked the meddling of Rome, and by Rome we may as well just say Julius Caesar, who is interestingly portrayed without his famed receding hairline. Mediterranean civilizations of the time clashed here, and that meant it was ultimately a huge time for change in the region, and periods of change is where Assassin's Creed has always worked best. There was likely an element of convenience to it too. Ptolemaic Egypt was a safer bet to translate into an open world game than say the Old Kingdom, where outside of significant events not a right lot is truly known, and the New Kingdom where Egypt was at its zenith and not a right lot happened. I do however see fringe criticisms that it should have been set far earlier, to which I disagree, both on the basis that there's only so much that is known and can therefore be tastefully translated into an Assassin's Creed game, and one of the better documented periods having such a turbulent run of events shaping the landscape is arguably not only the safe option, but has plenty of opportunities for storytelling. A point in time that not only had colossal historical figures such as Caesar, Cleopatra, Mark Antony, etc., but also a point in time in which all of the famous landmarks you'd want to see in a game set in ancient Egypt actually existed. Take Alexandria and its famous library and lighthouse. With such an opportunity staring you in the face, why strive for farther back with murkier details to sift through, only to still endure the exponentially increased risk of misrepresenting the setting by having to pull huge chunks of it out your arse when you can just opt for the safer bet and have that actually, in this rare instance I might add, be the good choice. That's not to say that Ubisoft strives for historical accuracy 100% of the time. It's a series about all of human history following a fallen civilization of space wizards. The games have never shied away from filling in the blanks, but ultimately rely on a firm historical basis as a springboard. And even Ptolemaic Egypt being over 2,000 years ago had a lot more blanks than Ubisoft were used to. And so the topics of accuracy and the right time to portray this land aside, the important aspect was more about nailing down the feel, allowing you to become enveloped in the idea of the setting. And did Assassin's Creed Origins work in that department from my perspective? Yes. The historical aspect to Assassin's Creed is one of the most important creative decisions that every title has had to contend with. This portion of the Hellenistic period within Egypt was a matter-of-fact sweet spot for a certified usage of a get-out-of-jail-free card. And like I said, the idea of ancient Egypt was something of a pipe dream among many Assassin's Creed fans, including myself, most of whom I would assume aren't Egyptologists. So if the game was set much further back than its actual setting, our idea of what ancient Egypt would look like would differ greatly from the world that Ubisoft would have to an extent, portray. using the fact that that veil is thinner much later on makes sense. And with the perfect opportunity for an Assassin's Creed story to be told there, why would Ubisoft bid to make their jobs more difficult? I never thought I'd be fighting in this corner shit. Whether this was the best placement for what was meant to be an origin story is another thing altogether. But I'm not here to lament over this shattering of Assassin's Creed lore. That sadly has been a multi-installment decline, and there's really no amount of surgery or plasters that can repair it. At this point you either commit to the shit or you put the series out of its misery, so I probably shan't go mentioning that again. Assassin's Creed Origins boasted a huge map to get lost in, and it's one of very few Assassin's Creed world spaces where it felt possible to truly get lost. Vast portions of this enormous world offer little more than a mere desert, and you'd probably be forgiven for thinking this wasn't a good thing. Ordinarily you'd be right. Even here, depending on how you view it, vast spaces of not very much isn't the most engaging. However, the adventure of being miles upon miles away from anywhere, simply wandering, slowly walking, either atop a camel or on foot in such a barren yet wonderfully detailed landscape is enthralling. As time disappears, the game makes note of your time in the desert, and provides hallucinations, mirages and haze that not just show the effect of the heat and dehydration on our protagonist Bayek, but allow us an insight into his mind. The game gives us dozens of hallucinations that can trigger out in the unforgiving climate as we wander. They not only break up the monotony of June after June, but actually make it something within itself to go out and look for, as they don't actually have any stat effects as such, and that's fine in a game like this because ultimately, it's the detail that counts. These details in particular hide insights into Bayek's mind for one, but may also be references and Easter eggs. The deserts of Assassin's Creed Origins are barren. Sometimes there are entire regions of nothing, especially as you venture farther south on the map, but each region still retains some distinction. You can tell the difference between the volcanic basalt of the Black Desert and the chalky White Desert, with its gorgeous rock formations, the low elevation of the sparse Katara Depression, and the gentle dunes of Giza, among which the distinct peaks of the pyramids kiss the skies. These regions aren't always empty, as Giza most certainly is a busy spot, but those that are far from empty in a negative sense, though sometimes they are positively empty, with little to nothing going on. Only a walk or ride ahead, one you feel you must persevere, as hallucinations and little discoveries encourage you onwards. The desert's placements, with the emptier regions being optional and towards the south of the map, with the story not really taking you there, really makes this fact feel deliberate. Their nature isn't to be filled with content, though I have criticisms about that overall with this game, but rather to be experienced. Much like the barren planets you can land on in Mass Effect 1, accented with the odd curiosity but otherwise being an unfamiliar landscape and horizon, Assassin's Creed Origins' barren desert regions are meant to be felt more so than they are to be explored. You soak in the beautiful landscape, this feeling of isolation, this mesmerization in nothingness is beautifully executed. It's an acquired thing to appreciate, I'll say that much, but nonetheless it is something that I like about Origins. Another thing I really enjoy is the simple pleasure of walking through a sandstorm, being unable to see but a few meters in front of you. It's a nice feature to add character to these landscapes. It pays reverence to their challenging nature, but it also enhances that vibe of isolation. You see Bayek struggling against the winds with the sand blasting against his face. As you reach where a storm is thickest, he might begin to stumble. There's just something simply fantastic about it. Now, of course, arid landscapes and ancient tombs aren't all Assassin's Creed Origins has to offer. We have other regions filled with more obvious life, towns and villages, cities such as Alexandria, Memphis, Crocodilopolis and Cyrene, which is actually in present-day Libya, which is really cool as an addition, even if it was my least favourite part of the map. On the front of atmosphere, the populated areas of Assassin's Creed Origins do suffer by comparison to the regions that aren't meant to be too densely populated. Alexandria's streets feel more barren than they should be, there aren't really enough people. Cyrene has a similar problem. Crocodilopolis and Memphis are quite building dense overall, but again hit a similar wall. It's frankly odd, stemming from a franchise that gave us dense crowds in AC Unity, but that game in general was a technical minefield, so you can't help but understand. The cities ultimately are kind of just there as the most I can say, but I'll highlight my gripes for that when we get around to talking a bit gameplay. For now, let's just summarise it by saying the cities of Origins don't feel anywhere near as compact as the cities in the games that came before it. There's still atmosphere to soak in, there are still landmarks to go and see, though the entire database being in the Discovery Tour, an entirely different game mode that you have to go to the main menu and then into, is a bit of a farce, though I actually quite like the Discovery Tour as an idea. Nonetheless, a thing I liked about Assassin's Creed 2, Brotherhood, Revelations 3, Black Flag, all the way up to Syndicate I believe, are these database entries that will pop up as you pass interesting points on the map, that would then, if you cared enough to read them, give you a brief explanation as to what it was you just saw. That no longer being baked into the actual gaming experience in exchange for a far more developed Discovery Tour, which is far more educational in context by default, was certainly an awkward trade. Don't get me wrong, I see the value in the Discovery Tour, I think it was a genuinely cool idea. But to justify and facilitate it, an aspect I really liked about the actual games had to kind of go. And henceforth, the historical aspect to Assassin's Creed was no longer about enriching the actual gaming experience, becoming or at least striving to be an educational tool. And while that's cool, it's in conflict with the intent of the base product. But of course, if you're thinking one thing shouldn't go against the other, you're right. But that was a Ubisoft decision with respect to this game. And it's felt. And it's felt nowhere worse than while exploring cities. To end this overall world ramble on a positive, however, Assassin's Creed Origins has a banger soundtrack. The music of this game brings it to life excellently. I don't know the first thing about music, so I'll sum it all up by saying Sarah Schachner did God's work. And my favourite track is probably the final minute of The Winds of Cyrene, which is now playing in the background, and if you're not sick of it by the end of today's video, it's because it's just that good. To move on from this portion of the video, I'll summarise the world of Assassin's Creed Origins, this depiction, this representation, this vibe of ancient Egypt, Ptolemaic Egypt, whichever end of the semantics debate you fall on, while not masterful and certainly flawed in some respects, was still pretty brilliant. But that counts for nothing without a vessel through which we explore this world.
You are the Magi from Siwa. I thought Magi was supposed to protect the Pharaoh. I am Magi to no Pharaoh. You see this? I can read my own name, Nat. We will find you. We will find you in your sleep. Sleep. I never sleep. I just wait in the shadows, and I will kill you all. Everyone who sniffed the air that day in Siwa!
Now where do I begin? Writing aside, Bayek of Siwa is phenomenal. The acting performance put in by Abubakar Salim is jaw-dropping. Now, I don't know the first thing about acting, just like I don't know the first thing about music, but were I to judge Assassin's Creed characters by that aspect alone, I think Bayek would just about come out on top. I have no idea why a cardboard cutout of him is in the window of the Preston Guildhall overlooking a Wetherspoons beer garden. It's quite threatening, really. But hey, if it makes somebody watching this video go on a pilgrimage to Preston in sunny old Lancashire just to see him, watching and waiting, I guess it was worth a mention. I'm sure the Spoons won't mind the custom. Next time I'm in Preston stealing guitars I truly don't have the first clue how to use, I'll let you know if he's still there. Now Bayek's ability to go from raw, terrifying and vengeful to warm, gentle, even jovial is sold 100 times over by Salim's performance. I do find the game's reliance on random panning non-cutscenes to be quite the hard sell storytelling wise in general, but when the game uses proper, actual cutscenes, you can see the extent of the effort going into making this fictional man feel real. The bar is set with the opening cutscene to the game, in which we see Bayek exercise his vengeful wrath against one of his targets, and every time this rage crops up following, it feels entirely believable. The power exercised through his anger is so potent you can't help but be convinced by it whenever it crops up, And the best part is that's not even his defining character trait. Abubakar Salim can do 0 just as easily as he can do 100, and so his character can flip to being more naturally gentle, demonstrated best in his cheerful playfulness when dealing with children. Despite his life as of the events of the game being dominated by his vengeful path, the game makes a point to ensure we know that hasn't become his personality. He's still a human being, one capable of an array of emotions, not simply one group. And because he deploys such a range with such earnesty, you can't help but, to a degree, feel what he feels. When he's compassionate, you feel it. And when the ruthless monster within comes out, you feel his fury. When he's overcome with grief, remorse and desperation, the performance resonates more than it has any right to. I'll elaborate on what I mean by that in a minute. And also, being a Medjay, a dutiful protector, he's a character we can reasonably believe would go off and do side quests. And you feel his sense of responsibility and duty too. His mission of retribution is not the only mission he takes seriously, and you can see that. And of course, being a product of the setting, he serves wonderfully as an access point to the world Ubisoft had created. It's with him that we find ourselves in this land's civilized centres and most barren of wastelands, and he isn't silent as we make discoveries. He runs commentary at times, allowing us to understand the culture of the world he's familiar with for one, but also ensuring we're made aware of when we find something that surprises even him. It's through him we further observe just how old Egypt's many points of interest can be. It's through his words that we're allowed to understand when the game displays the more alien aspects of this ancient culture to us, and it's through him that we understand this world changing, fading into the cultural melting pot of encroaching Greeks and Romans. Bayek is a character I enjoy spending time with. His ability to go from such a friendly demeanour to one of cold ruthlessness when the situation demands it is an impressive display of range, and Abubakar Salim is the calibre of actor who can convince you of both extremes, not to mention everything in between. His portrayal has an honesty to it that extends far beyond merely that of a professional on just another job. He became immersed in Bayek of Siwa, and that sincerity translated into an unforgettable performance. But does that mean the writing always did him justice? Well, let's move on to that. You see, I don't think this is an area Origins is remotely immune from criticism in. Unlike the sequences of older Assassin's Creed titles, Assassin's Creed Origins falls more into having 3 acts. Act 1 lays the foundations, albeit in a very strange order that I can only imagine was devised to speed up the pacing so we could be released into the open world as soon as possible. But nonetheless, it's here where we learn that Bayek pursues a mysterious masked organisation known as the Order of Ancients because they killed his son. Naturally, revenge plots are met with groaning when it comes to Assassin's Creed these days, and I can't help but understand why. The theme wasn't entirely original within the brand, with Assassin's Creed 2, Assassin's Creed 3 to a degree, and also Assassin's Creed Unity all grappling with it, so understandably the risk for it hitting a plateau of platitudes is quite high. Nonetheless, such a trope wouldn't be used so often if it wasn't so reliable as a hook for an action story. So we join Bayek as he's actually actively hunting this Order of Ancients and had already claimed one life in his quest for retaliation. We actually join him a year into his mission as he returns to his home, Siwa, to discover it's fallen under the control of yet another member of the Order of Ancients, a fellow named Mudunaman. And so naturally he becomes Bayek's next target. We're introduced to Bayek's friend and fellow Medjay Hepsifer, and it's important you remember him because the game certainly won't. Nonetheless, their bond, one of brotherhood, is far from unconvincing. Hepsifer aids Bayek by equipping him with the knowledge of his target. Mudunaman, known under his Order of Ancients cryptonym, the Ibis, has been torturing Siwans in his mission to unlock a vault beneath the Temple of Amunhir. And outside of the story, Bayek must level up to level 5 in order to comfortably take on the task. Naturally, that's what eats up the bulk of the playtime here in Siwa, and is an issue with Assassin's Creed Origins worth raising. It's something you're sure to notice if you play on New Game Plus without enemy scaling on, and that is that the actual story content is incredibly fast and fleeting. It's balancing out with the side content you have to undertake to level up on a first playthrough at least, but the actual narrative contents as a result can come across somewhat erratic, because from here the bulk of the Mudunaman plot at least is Bayek kills him. And while the side quests do in a way hinge on liberating Siwa from the Order of Ancients' control, it still feels like extra content rather than a substitute for a more properly formatted run of events. And so particularly the first and third act suffer from this quick-fire problem-solution layout without the struggle in the middle that makes it altogether satisfying. That being said, Madunnaman's assassination does lead to the flashbacks in which we see how Bayek's son died, inspiring this revenge mission. The actual moments we see aren't bad, but it's the order in which they're delivered, being tailored to ensuring they're delivered in quick succession, that I just frankly don't understand. I appreciate concise storytelling, and I like a nice compact Assassin's Creed story, but with Origins also trying to be a big, albeit light, RPG, it can afford itself the time to flesh itself out properly. It would have been nice to spend a bit more time with Bayek and his son at the start of the game, then have that tragic event that drives him down this vengeful path, at which point you can have the time skip and have it make sense in a chronological context. Sure, it's artistic, you could argue, in its current layout, and being dropped into this awesome confrontation certainly did have its merits, but I reckon this scene would have been more satisfying with some context going in. The defenestration of chronology out the gate isn't frustrating within itself, but the organisation of the opening is there to serve a quick-fire delivery of plot points without giving them much time to breathe. And while the levelling system does necessitate that you go off and do a few side quests in this region before you assassinate Madunnaman, they don't really further that plot. They aren't unrelated either, they just kind of meander. So the length of the game is unhindered, it's not a short game, but the percentage that equates to meaningful plot is quite limited. And this issue persists upon our arrival in Alexandria. Sure, the Yamu subplot is probably well worth your time, but that's not main content, that's side content that you probably should do because you've got a level now. But upon our arrival in Alexandria, Bayek seeks out his wife, Aya. A fellow named Thanos, which just makes me think of Thanos if he was from a council estate, guides us from the library to her hideout, so that's a problem resolved instantly. As it turns out, she's been busy killing Order of Ancients members as well, seemingly leaving only the Snake to go, whom she's been working with Cleopatra and a fellow named Apollodorus to uncover the identity of. She gives us the hidden blade, which is cool, and sends us to uncover the identity of the Snake and assassinate Gennadius, a Firelake who's been on her tail. So we go to the fort where he's based up and kill him immediately, resolving the problem before it actually manifests any symptoms. I understand this guy's a threat and needs to go, there are consequences following this action, so it does have some merit for that. But as with Madunnaman back in Siwa, it feels like something is missing in between being told to kill the guy and killing the guy. It's not an innate case of lacking quality. It's merely the plot points not being allowed to marinate for the sake of being quick when that's counterintuitive already. Aya simply tells you he's a problem, so you blitz the fort he's in and fuck him up, while he's doing little more than loitering. You wouldn't even need to increase the runtime of this particular part of the plot by much to demonstrate the risk he poses. Sure, you can observe him engage in something of a schedule if you aren't quick to pounce, but that's a kind of detail you'd need to know was even there to look for, and it isn't really a substitute for seeing the man's proactive pursuit of Aya baked into the story. So, while the pacing of the storytelling is actually fast, because of level gating and things like that, it actually takes you a time to burn through it, so even if it's trying to be quick, it's still taking a while anyway. They might as well put those bits of story in there, as I reckon that would even the pacing out a bit. Fortunately, with this next bit, we aren't given the identity of the Snake off the bat, and have to make our way into a restricted area to investigate and find his identity out for ourselves. It's in doing this that we uncover the man's name is Eudorus and he's the royal scribe. We learn he likes a good soak in the bathhouse, and naturally that's why we go to find him. We also learn a bit about the Order of Ancients conspiracy, but nonetheless we earn our way to the bathhouse where we have to sneak past his guards and drop in from above. Not only do we have a middle part here, but it culminates in a unique mission where you're not just storming another fort, or indeed a temple fortified by guards, which may as well be the same thing. There's a much tighter atmosphere to this moment, and it's as it should be because this is where Bayek believes his journey finally comes to an end. We know it doesn't because we're far too early in the story for that, but there's actual weight to this, and it elaborates what I'm trying to say. The quality in storytelling isn't lacking in this opening act. It just rushes up until this point, and it's here where it finally takes a breather. I put this scene in because I really like how it's done. Bayek loses his finger to his hidden blade in the heat of the moment in killing Eudorus, and while the explanation provided by Odyssey after it that he was wearing it on the wrong side of his wrist alongside all of the assassins until after the Levantine Brotherhood, over 1,000 years later, just makes the assassins seem stupid. It shows the birth of a tradition born from Bayek's sacrifice, severing his finger to end the snake. However, Eudorus' confession leaves him coming away feeling as though he wasn't actually the snake, and there are more members of the Order out there. Nonetheless, the weight of this moment is felt, and genuinely, I really like how it was handled. Now, I suppose this scene is open to interpretation as to whether or not Bayek knew he was going to sever his finger. It seems like it was an accident for the blade to fire there, but it actually, when you think about it, was timed too well. I like the idea that Bayek committed to sacrificing his finger. After all, he was aware of that possibility as Aya stopped him from doing that for no reason just a few minutes earlier.
Ingenious.
Therefore, I view this scene as a moment of commitment. So Act 1 is a platter of brilliant ideas that ultimately doesn't linger long enough in favour of side quests of varying degrees of relevance. It's not terribly weak as a result, quite the opposite. It is, however, somewhat flawed. However, Act 2 is where I can really see and appreciate what the game was going for. Origin's second act begins with Bayek being brought into Aya's fold with Apollodorus and Cleopatra. He's brought to Apollodorus' residence where the Queen is entertaining guests. They meet and she explains that the Order of Ancients runs far deeper than Bayek realises. We get given a new series of 4 targets: the Scarab, the Hyena, the Lizard and the Crocodile. We're to venture to 4 different regions and uncover the identities behind these aliases through a good old-fashioned investigation. Cleopatra says the thing.
It is time for assassinations.
My will to live with that dialogue thoroughly leaves the chat, and we crack on. Now, my irrational hatred for a piece of throwaway dialogue aside, this is of course where Assassin's Creed Origins begins to pick up a bit. Where Act 1 was mostly good, albeit poorly paced, Act 2 doesn't have this pacing problem. We're now thoroughly embedded in the chronology, so there are no flashbacks and things, and while we can in theory tackle these 4 investigations in any order, their levels sort of give you an idea of where to start and where to go from there. This is the moment where the world properly becomes our oyster as well. This is where it makes sense for Bayek to go off and do other things in between. The game properly becomes open here with how much of the open world it exposes you to. It's at this point you'll likely find yourself exploring the pyramids in Giza and the other tombs in the region, engaging in plentiful side quests to fill in the gaps and finding more distractions. This any order layout isn't ideal over the course of the entire story, but in this middle part, it works nicely as you naturally follow the path of least resistance anyway, hopping from one target to the next as and when you're ready. This to me is where the chunk of time in AC Origins is typically spent, and there's no real point rushing. Naturally, Bayek as a Magi would intervene in local affairs as and when he feels he needs to here, helping those in need and allowing us the room to soak in the atmosphere of this world. This part of the game feels like the longest portion, not because the story contents outstay their welcome, but because this is the part of the game the first act was hurrying to get you to, so that you can go out and soak in the rest of the open world, and all of the activities it has to offer. Now, as for this elimination of targets aspect to the game, I can really see what it's going for. Now, it's not emulating how Assassin's Creed 1 formatted its mysterious element behind the Templar hunts, but I can certainly see some inspiration. This doesn't make us take initiative in quite the same way, or more accurately provide the illusion of initiative, but we're to uncover the identities of these conspirators through quests that reveal them to us over the course of their respective stories. Being in different regions allows some of the side quests present to further accent the goings-on surrounding these characters, and then, after not too long, the identity of the target is revealed to us. There's an unmistakable ethos of mystery and investigation to it that really sucks you in. The Scarab is revealed to be a fellow named Taharka, who is digging up Letopolis, reclaiming it from the desert. At first, he seems a noble, honourable man whom Bayek confuses for an ally, before learning he in fact was the ruthless Scarab himself, complicit in torture and mutilation, having removed his own father-in-law's tongue to protect his identity, and having the preferred method of execution of burying people up to their necks in the desert, leaving them to die from dehydration. A fate Bayek almost suffers upon Taharka betraying him. I like the Scarab, very ominous villain. Could have done with more flesh and actual core plot of it, but that's a pretty constant theme in Origins. Personally, I'd have had the Scarab be an ally over the course of the other 3 assassinations in this particular chapter, so to speak. This revelation would then highlight a disunity within the Order, as a weakness for Bayek to exploit, and also allow that betrayal to cut deeper. Nonetheless, the Scarab's particular brand of ruthlessness is incredibly standout. Out in Giza, beneath the majestic pyramids, the Hyena, a woman named Khaliset, works to resurrect her departed daughter. Bayek relates with Khaliset, and her motives don't appear to coincide with themes of dominance over the land, unlike her co-conspirators. But ultimately, Bayek is unable to convince her to abandon her obsession, and has to end her suffering as she bids to inflict atrocities upon others in her misguided rituals. I like the Hyena questline because it's a dual tragedy. Bayek comes up against an enemy who shares his pain, and unlike his other targets, attempts to reason with his foe. It's a nice departure from the unbridled fury he displays against other members of the Order, however justified. It shows Bayek is capable of rationale, even when faced with one of the mysterious Order that robbed him of his son. He knows enough to tell apart a lost soul from a damned one, and tries to appeal to that aspect of Khaliset, and while of course it doesn't work, as killing is frankly much more fun, we also see that not every member of the Order of Ancients is entirely bad, and the purpose of it isn't evil for evil's sake. These people have goals that lead them to carry out unethical deeds, and it's good to see that at least conveyed somewhat. Over in Memphis, the historical capital of Egypt is plunged into a paranormal tragic miasma, where unexplainable occurrences are attributed to the work of a foul curse. However, this is of course the work of the Lizard, a priest named Hatepi, who is identified with a cough. Rather than allowing us to locate and simply kill the guy upon discovering his identity, we must first identify him manually, made possible as a result of his chronic splutter, as he's dressed entirely identically to other characters. I like this approach as it causes you to pause and think. While it would be annoying if deployed every single time, it really works here as a one-time thing, as a distinct objective, as you have to strike with precision and not claim the life of an innocent, confusing him with Hatepi. The atmosphere of Memphis at this point in the game is also something to behold. The city finds itself in a constant haze of miserable fog, and the game uses this rich atmosphere to tap into ancient Egyptian mythology in a tasteful manner, through hallucinations, as Bayek bids to aid those in need as he gets to the bottom of this mystery. Going into Origins for the first time, I never thought I'd be fighting a giant snake in an Assassin's Creed game, but it was an appropriate deployment of such an element. More importantly than anything else, however, the plot gives you something unique to do here. And finally, we have the crocodile in Fayum, an elderly, ruthless, pragmatic Greek stateswoman named Berenice, whom, in order to keep her identity a secret, murders a child named Shadia, a truth only revealed to Bayek after he enters the arena in Crocodilopolis to interrogate the Gallic gladiators believed to have been involved in her murder. In this pursuit, Bayek's path converges with an old friend, Kensa. Like Hepzibah, you best remember her because the story certainly won't. You can choose to kill her as she protects the crocodile later on, however, she sort of lives, canonically. In killing Berenice, Bayek is angry and screams Shadia's name over and over, ensuring the last thing the remorseless woman heard was the name of the little girl whose life she had ripped away. This is probably one of the more fleshed out assassinations in the game, as we see Shadia as an upbeat child, one whom Bayek clearly delighted in the company of for the brief time we knew her. She wasn't hugely present within herself, but you could see him incensed by her senseless death. Should we linger here, we also get to see her parents, Hotefries and Henut's grief as they deal with the loss of their child. Bayek relates to his allies here, having also lost a child. It's a good touch, if a bit somber, but the game has a right thing for the horrid idea of children becoming victims to the Order's conspiracy. It's a ruthlessly efficient way to portray the Order of Ancients as malevolent villains, motivations aside, and we feel Bayek's conviction against the Order harden. And though it was already rock solid, it's here where it sinks the deepest. These 4 middle assassination missions do have their drawbacks, but ultimately they're heavily subsidised by the world itself. The game encourages you to slow down here, to soak it all in, to engage in side content, to go into tombs, to explore forgotten passages, to do the heavy lifting and padding out the experience where the story really doesn't have to. And while I still think I would have liked a bit more flesh to each individual target, this middle portion of the game exposes you to this open world tremendously. This is the land Bayek is protecting from the Order of Ancients. The world here assumes the role of a crucial character in its own right. It serves to motivate us, to push us onwards. It truly does feel like these 4 assassinations are carried out for the greater good of the nation. There is an Aya naval mission in the mix as well, and frankly I'm not entirely sure what there is to say about it. I think I'll save talking about Aya for later on. But with these 4 targets disposed of, and plenty of Egypt has been adequately seen, all that remains is to head for Heraklion and inform Cleopatra of our success, and I can't help but feel the plot drifting to the edge of a cliff. It's here where we link back up with Aya, Cleopatra and Apollodorus, and more shenanigans occur.
Shit-giving is my job.
The story does go a bit downhill from here as events become quite muddled. Basically, more members of the Order are named as the Scorpion and the Jackal, the latter of whom happens to be a man named Lucius Septimius, who plans to assassinate Cleopatra, a plan thwarted by Bayek and Aya, though Pompey, whom Aya had previously appealed to in a naval mission as an ally, is rather famously decapitated. So that naval mission was for nothing, but it's rooted in history, so I'll allow it, forcing Cleopatra to boldly enter Alexandria via another naval mission, then hidden in a rug where she secures an alliance with Caesar and a civil war kicks off. After a couple skirmishes and some downtime, that sort of ends as soon as it started. Bayek and Julius Caesar ride a chariot being chased by a massive elephant for some reason.
There will be songs of us, Bayek!
Bayek confronts Septimius for the murder of his son. He's a big, intimidating man whose choice in weapon is grossly inefficient. Bayek is denied Septimius' head, but manages to kill the Scorpion. It's also revealed that both Caesar and Cleopatra are now under the influence of the Order, though the game doesn't deign to establish how long that's been brewing. Presumably the Order, via Septimius, wanted sway over Caesar, and Cleopatra just happened to be his ally at the time by this point. It's hard to keep track, and thus Bayek and Aya are denied justice by the ruler whom they'd backed, and are left fairly high and dry. An on-brand Assassin's Creed commentary on monarchs for certain. Shame I saw it coming. Not only that, AC2 suggests Cleopatra died by an assassin's hand. So yeah, this had been brewing for about 8 years by 2017. Cleopatra cutting ties with Bayek and Aya as she ascended properly to the throne was pretty standard and honestly expected. This is probably where Act 3 starts, by the way. Not necessarily in a calamitous conclusion to the middle part, but certainly in a way that felt a bit quick again. There's an awful lot going on in a very short time frame, so it becomes quite difficult to get your bearings. Please ignore this camera bug, it was really annoying. And look, I do see the value in having us directly involved in historical events in Assassin's Creed games, but I think it's more important when the well-known events are occurring in the peripheral of the plot. It gives some flexibility for what's actually happening for one and allows the storytelling to dictate the pacing, and everything else is a bit condensed here because they wanted an epic battle which they didn't accomplish and all we got was firing arrows up an elephant's arse until it died. No matter, this betrayal going into Act 3 serves its purpose, and it's at this point where we see the Assassin Brotherhood begin to form. Apollodorus is killed, which is a shame because he'd have been a banger villain reveal, instead revealing the leader of the Order of Ancients, at least at this point, to be a background character who shows up a handful of times and practically says nothing, Flavius Metellus, the Lion. Apollodorus warns Bayek and Aya with his dying breath that Flavius is headed for Siwa, where we find the Oasis in despair once again. Classic EC technology trickery appears to have been deployed, and as we descend into the chamber referenced at the start of the game, we see it. A golden, digital globe spinning in the centre of the room. No sign of our foes, and Hepzibah from the start of the game, who hasn't been relevant since, dead. I see why somebody had to die here. Hepzibah was a sound choice for that, but I wish we'd had more moments with him to sell us more on his and Bayek's camaraderie. It would have made his murder here more impactful. His passing instead is a meh moment sold purely on the back of Abu Bakr Salim's sustained excellent performance. And I can't say his pain didn't come across. I just think Hepzibah hasn't been done justice in this story. And this is a recurring thing with this plot. Characters die that we aren't properly equipped to care about. You can make an argument for Apollodorus being better supplied than that, but even he's underutilised really. But yeah, it keeps happening where we're either introduced to characters and then not given the opportunity to get to know them until they do die, or a character dies before we properly get to know them, and it just weakens the impact potential that moment had. Anyway, with Hepzibah put to rest, Bayek now in possession of his sword that is constantly on fire, which would have been useful if Hepzibah was aware of that particular function. It's time to head north to Cyrene and put an end to Flavius and sever Egypt from the Order's influence for good, or at least for now. I will say I do take issue with the main antagonist being revealed as a guy who shows up a couple of times as a background character with little more input than just that. I appreciate the subtlety Ubisoft were attempting to go for with this, mind you. The idea of him being in the shadows, hidden but in plain sight, right under Bayek and Aya's noses the whole time. It's a chilling thought, and if delivered right it would have been fantastic. But showing up once when we first meet Caesar in the corner of the room, saying nothing, and once again in the tomb of Alexander the Great, with that being it aside from a couple of cutscenes where he's just there, truly isn't enough for the audience to clock on to any hint of further significance. Had Flavius cropped up more times outside his directing of Bayek's blade into his son's chest at the start of the game while masked, and these few instances, perhaps he'd have commanded a more fascinating presence that allowed him to take a hold of the main villain role with more steady ground beneath him. As things stand, however, there really isn't much that makes Flavius all that interesting. To put it into perspective, you know, like classic murder mystery TV shows where detectives are trying to get to the bottom of a murder, they interview various suspects over the course of the episode. Flavius's reveal is the equivalent to, at the end of the episode, the killer being revealed to be somebody we've never fucking met. Because he's just a generic Roman general whose character isn't explored even remotely prior to his big reveal, and his personality following is just that of a generic Roman general. He wouldn't have been a bad mid-game target, but as the overall antagonist, at least from Bayek's perspective, was somewhat disappointing. However, of course, it's not really the true ending of the game, as that rests with Aya. However, Bayek's warpath in the name of his son ends here, and it isn't all rough. His assassination of Flavius manifests in a good character moment for Bayek, where he realises that in killing Flavius he'll lose his son forever, never to see him again, at least not in this life. This moment is a truly emotional one for Bayek as you see him waver, as if part of him really wants this chase to go on forever, for there to be more members of this clandestine faction for him to eliminate. But most of all, we see the pain of a father coming to terms with the fact that no amount of slaughter will bring his boy back, no amount of rage can right the wrong that was done to him. And while the moral commentary on display is far too cliché to be interesting in the slightest, Abu Bakr Salim's performance again seizes the spotlight. So within this shattered memory, this confession room, Bayek's son Kemu comes and completes the job symbolically for his father, allowing him to finally be at peace from the perspective of Bayek's own pious beliefs. And with Flavius's death, Bayek is liberated from his rage. It's a real shame this portion of the game feels so hurried, because it denies this payoff the impact it deserves. More time was needed to flesh out Flavius, both before and after his reveal. He needed to be directly as a named character involved in events for longer for us to realistically view him as one to watch, and while I get the point is you don't see him coming, because he's so vapid as a character you don't actually see him going either. Apollodorus would have been a good fit for a villain reveal if you ask me, and I don't say that because I'd realistically go down that route, but I'd plant the seed of doubt and have it be explored somewhat, perhaps in tandem with Flavius being present in events as a character that is actually engaged with. I know the rest of the plot wasn't really geared for that to be an option, but it would have been interesting to have Flavius, for instance, manipulate a subversion, perhaps even manipulate Bayek and Aya into killing Apollodorus, only for it to then be uncovered that Flavius is indeed the lion. This is because if you intend for your main antagonist to be a mystery until the last possible moment, you need that mystery to be constantly moving, properly building as you go along rather than suddenly just being revealed when needed merely because. Origins does well with its individual mysteries as you discern the identities of your targets one at a time, but perhaps it would have been beneficial for there to be more overarching hints, information and curious character moments for shifty side characters to inhabit and detail this overarching plot. Flavius should not have been a fly on the wall until the plot necessitated he become more. He should have been fleshed out first as an ally of sorts, or as a character we observe more one way or another. I think the Siege of Alexandria and the Battle of the Nile should have been a longer portion of the plot to facilitate and explore this idea more comprehensively. What we got instead was an annoyingly superficial villain in a very disjointed third act, when clearly there was meant to be so much more to this part of the story. I wasn't entirely disinterested in Flavius. I see the framework of a more compelling foe, but none of it is translated into the game. He simply explains to us that Bayek's son's death sent Bayek down a path of vengeance that allowed him to rise the ranks of the Order of Ancients as his comrades fell, one by one, and his motivations for this ambition is purely hostility for the sake of it. While I wouldn't go so far as to say this flaccid third act soured the experience, it does stink of cut content. And while I was more invested in Bayek as a character than anything he was actually doing from more or less jump anyway, I do think more should have been done here to allow for a smoother landing for his arc. However, the game doesn't really end there, as we still have Aya's ending to mull over. It's an unusual choice to have the ending of a game sit with a character who is not the main protagonist, and unfortunately Aya's side of Assassin's Creed Origins also stinks of cut content. It feels a lot was removed from the game with respect to Aya. We got a couple naval missions with her as part of the main story, and there's another as a side quest, but it does honestly make her a hard sell because I couldn't quite tell you what Ubisoft's hard-on for naval was all about to begin with. It made sense for 3 and Black Flag, but frankly after that, I can't say I was ever mentally equipped to enjoy Origin's approach to naval. It just kind of exists, so having this eat up a lot of the playing time we get with Aya does kind of make me count down the minutes until I'm playing as Bayek again. But fortunately, the game doesn't just dedicate Aya to the naval, she does have other gameplay. We get to play as her for huge chunks as part of the Alexandria Shenanigans, without the agony of having a trireme to maneuver and do combat with. Even then, her secondary playable character role in the middle of the game is utilised less so to enrich the storytelling, but rather to speed up the pacing, when that's really not what it needed and comes across as a huge misuse of the character. Especially when she's dealing with the same struggles that Bayek is, having also lost her son, who, in case I haven't made it clear, is the same person. And when we cross paths with Aya as Bayek, we see that she does indeed have an arc that's unravelling. And it's how both of these characters go about pursuing justice, vengeance, and all those other exciting words that we see their marriage crumble to make way for something new. And that new something is of course the Hidden Ones, the proto-assassins. The plot elaborates from Bayek's point of view quite well that their mission has taken over their entire lives, and as a result their bond has shattered. But Aya doesn't receive the same service when it's beyond apparent that once upon a time, probably earlier in development, there were meant to be more moments for her. Otherwise, why would you trail off Bayek's story and finish the game, concluding the entire story with that of Aya? So following another naval mission at the very end here, in which we sink more ships, Aya finds herself in Rome, where she finally confronts and kills Septimius, who reveals to us that Caesar is the father of understanding, whatever that is supposed to mean here. So Aya infiltrates the theatre of Pompey and assassinates Caesar, or at least does so disguised as a member of the Roman Senate. After her initial blow, they all dive in and start chefing the guy, which is a cool way to not entirely distort the man's end, and also gave me flashbacks to my last visit to London. From an enjoyer of history's perspective, I like that killing Caesar found its way into the plot. He certainly had more going on than Flavius, both as a fairly well-known historical figure and as a character in the story. And I don't know enough about Caesar to speak with authority about the actual quality of his depiction here, but his death being the final deed of the game is just so much more satisfying than that of Flavius, who was just kind of there even when he was the objective. As for Septimius, he's just a big antagonistic looking dude, and that's all he really offers, even in his departure from this mortal world. He never stands properly on his own 2 feet, but unlike Flavius, is never forced to. He's just a brute Aya kills in order to get to Caesar. But the most important takeaway from this is we see how the Assassin Brotherhood, or at least this primitive form of it, emerged not just in ancient Egypt, but Egypt and Rome, with Aya establishing a brotherhood in Rome. So the plot does inevitably find its way to represent the subtitle Origins, though I don't personally think Origins was an appropriate title for this game, as that brotherhood is very much so sort of crammed into this rushed final act. And while the Hidden Ones DLC expands upon things a bit, I always do my best to view DLC as their own thing. I do believe the Hidden Ones should have emerged more towards the middle of the main story, really. That gives us time to see it actually develop rather than either exist or not. That would have made some sense of all the side quests where Bayek encounters characters he seemingly knows, does a couple of bits and bats with them and then fucks off, for them to then show up in the DLC as members of the Brotherhood. This would have also allowed the game to establish the foundations of the philosophy of the Brotherhood a bit better, and where the Assassin's principles, maybe not entirely but in part, stem from. We do see some of that in the Hidden Ones expansion, but this is certainly a subject I'd have liked the main story to tackle more in depth. After all, that is the story the title is there to suggest the game is about. And unfortunately the back end of the plot just doesn't really service that to the highest degree. The overall writing was there, the framework was there, but it felt as if, especially towards the back end, huge chunks of the plot were just missing. But Origins had a saving grace. I could at the very least see what they were trying to accomplish. And to top it all off, if you've got a main protagonist who can gaslight the player into thinking they're experiencing something perhaps better than it really is, that within itself is a redeeming quality. When this game was new, after the DLCs had come and gone, I yearned for a sequel with Bayek, because where the contents of the story were too disjointed to carry the narrative, Abu Bakr Salim's performance most certainly did. Now, I think I've chewed your ear off enough with regards to this game's story, so let's shift on and talk gameplay, because apparently games do in fact have that. Now, if you're one who views Origins gameplay as maybe a bit bland and dull, I can absolutely see where you're coming from. Various key aspects to Assassin's Creed gameplay had indeed seen serious simplification for implementation in this RPG generation of titles. The parkour, for instance, is so unremarkable and outright discouraged by the otherwise nicely delivered world that it wasn't merely no longer a staple of what makes Assassin's Creed stand out, it was barely even worth mentioning altogether. Sure, you can still climb, albeit you need no longer seek out pathways composed of intelligently placed obstacles and sticking out bits on walls to clamber on in particular. You can more or less climb on any surface unless the game says no for some reason, such as the pyramids or the Pharos of Alexandria, incidentally making climbing those structures more engaging, more fun. Jumping from rooftop to rooftop is also rendered far less consistent, as the game will constantly drag you back down to the ground rather than across to the next rooftop, showing a real lack of significance regarding engaging in this aspect of gameplay. Not always, but sometimes. It's clear it wasn't a huge priority. Nonetheless, it still has its moments here and there. It more so exists now to ensure that you can move in any direction at any point than to serve a higher purpose within the game. And while it's a shame, from the perspective of having played Assassin's Creed since the first one, it was frankly whatever at this point, as Ubisoft quickly fell out of love with the parkour, opting for more animation-based antics from 3 onwards anyway. The parkour is certainly an area that was destined to be lost in a game with the scope of presenting to us a huge portion of Egypt, with most of it being little more than a desert anyway, so I won't pretend I was the most mad to see it dumbed down to the point where it merely exists to allow you to move in a straight line wherever you happen to be, but I can certainly see why whittling it down to such a simple, rather dull, function may very well be infuriating. Now, I did miss the parkour systems of old, but my understanding of its importance and how it promoted player agency was largely retroactive in how it came to me, so in a way I've got to thank games like Origins for showcasing the system minus the intricacies that rendered it so noteworthy. But that wasn't the only thing that was simplified. Movement was another, or at least a broader topic that might encompass the parkour if you're feeling pedantic. In previous Assassin's Creed games, the default moving pace was a nice, leisurely walk, low-profile actions that allow you to blend with your environment. It slows you down as to not draw attention to yourself, and also to give you that means to physically observe at the same pace as the NPCs around you. Being one with the crowd as an assassin was not a gimmick, it was your neutral starting point. It's an immersive feature to have that as the default system, with the trigger allowing you to slip into more high-profile actions such as running and climbing that draw more attention to yourself. In Origins, you do need to hold the button to climb, but running is your default movement. You need some serious joystick control for walking to not break out into an awkward slow jog every few seconds. It's an unusual choice, but I think I know why it is this way, so please bear with me with that. The RPG era, beginning with Origins, facilitated many other changes to the gameplay. Eagle vision was sort of gone in Origins, being replaced with an animus pulse that highlights loot wherever it may be hidden, along with other curiosities and a more literal take on eagle vision. I suppose with the controllable bird mechanic, the game rinses at every given opportunity to highlight where your given objective may specifically be after you get within range of it. Senu is used to mark enemies, find treasure, and can also be utilised to observe the pathways of targets, and you'll wind up relying on this mechanic in virtually every single quest. I like the idea, though find its implementation annoying due to the sheer volume of it. Soaring through the skies as an eagle, uninhibited by Bayek's positioning however, is a very nice touch, and being able to do a barrel roll is pretty cool, so I'll give it props for that. You can plant Bayek on one end of the map, press up on the D-pad and fly all the way across it as Senu, and then when you're done you just simply back out of playing as Senu and you'll go back to Bayek. It might load, but you'll get there, and that's something I do respect. I also think this idea isn't innately dismal because it does indeed seem to be something that at times would be helpful if not somewhat easy. When, however, the controllable eagle is mandated by well over 90% of all the quests you might do in this world, it does become very easy to take for granted and its flaw will glare you straight in the face. A bird's eye view this frequently doesn't aid Origins in feeling remotely grounded. Assassin's Creed has never needed this helping hand to not feel grounded either. The game also never really explains how Bayek can either A. understand the information Senu, an eagle, is feeding to him, or B. see through the eyes of this bird. It doesn't make a lot of sense from the perspective of how Assassin's Creed typically disguised its in-game-isms prior to this point as the handiwork of the Animus, but you know what, never mind, that's not the problem that it has. You see, funneling virtually all locate objectives to this controllable bird mechanic is a bit of a tricky one, as it doesn't really help embed you in your environment. You aren't using a plethora of tools at your disposal to balance navigating a new area with seeking something in particular. You just press up on the D-pad, circle about in the sky for a bit, and look around as you would anywhere else, and when you view it from that perspective, Senu's application does come across as a bit bland, as it can bypass the intricacies of on-the-ground navigation. The controllable eagle mechanic, when you think about it, is the perfect representation of why there are many people out there who aren't too keen on Ubisoft open worlds. And while I don't really believe Origins to be their worst offender in this regard, it is a good symbol for it, and that is that at times it feels like you're just on the world rather than in it. As Senu, you're flying above the world, you're over it. Senu guides us to what we need to see with HUD cues and all sorts, but as for everything that doesn't realistically need seeing, from this height you aren't going to see it. Mapping out an area from the sky is just an excuse to not explore it from the ground, and this isn't me making a case for the controllable eagle mechanic being counterintuitive. It's a subconscious developer commentary there's nothing to fucking see. Except sometimes with Origins there is, and where there isn't, there probably should be. Ubisoft open worlds get so caught up in delivering scope that they forget to detail that world. Origins, while very far from their worst offender, sometimes stumbles here too. I don't think its intent is to deliberately bypass details, as the game doesn't shy away from attention to detail in its world as we've already gone over, and with respect to Senu, should Bayek remain stationary for long enough, she will actually land on Bayek's arm. The controllable eagle mechanic ultimately is a convenience the game doesn't need, but for some reason the mission design is very much so built around it. Away from that, mind you, we've got bigger fish to fry. Assassin's Creed's struggle between combat and stealth has always been an interesting one to see unfold over the years. Origins certainly prioritises combat, however stealth at least is viable. Detection cones aren't balanced nicely, and being seen can very quickly see you detected, providing no margin of error realistically, or quick dashes you can utilise, and there's this annoying slow motion thing that ensures you know you've been detected and drags that moment out for what feels like an eternity, but other times they'll see you but not immediately detect. The unreliable detection system really limits the stealth overall. You can't realistically allow yourself to be briefly seen to draw enemies to your last known location as seen in Unity and Syndicate, but the stealth system can be tackled. It can be done in a lot of instances, but the game is constantly trying to goad you towards combat, and once you're in that detected state, the game assumes you'll want to stay there. I will say I find the Hidden Blade not necessarily instant killing from stealth a bit weird. I get the RPG elements make it a tricky one, as stealth in that setting would imbalance the game and inversely encourage itself, which also isn't hugely ideal for AC, and I'll explain what I mean in a moment after I've paid some mind to combat. But hear me out here, a blade to the throat makes no sense to not function as an instant kill. Social stealth no longer exists, at least not in Origins. It does return a bit in Valhalla, but here it isn't a thing. There's no blending with crowds, no sitting on benches. You can still hide in haystacks in fairness, but your stealth options are limited to crouching behind objects, around corners, in bushes, and hiding in these haystacks, and that feels so much narrower in its effective capacity versus moving crowds you can disappear into, benches you can sit on, hiding spots galore after you break the line of sight that allow you to slip away and vanish. It's an odd choice to strip social stealth back along with the more intricate systems at play in the parkour in one game. as that's where the bulk of Assassin's Creed's gameplay identity came from. And it's because of these simplifications, that loss of regard for high versus low profile actions, that reduces the need for any distinction. This is why movement has been relegated to sprinting everywhere like a madman, as the AI doesn't respond differently to it. Stealth in AC Origins is viable, but it isn't as fun as it used to be. At least there aren't many tailing missions in this game, though I suspect the reasoning for that is because the game has no mechanic that introduces risk to such a setup, as seen when they actually use it once in a quest and you can practically be among your targets you're following, and they don't really care. Stealth is definitely a point of disappointment with Origins, saved only through its not entirely neutered function. Its usage is very limited versus where it should be, but the game isn't inherently wrong to not treat it as an overt priority over combat. It's just far too simple for Assassin's Creed realistically. Combat, on the other hand, I can't really say I hated Origins combat. I didn't like its adaptation in Odyssey and the grindy nature I perceived in it, but here it works fine. It's fairly straightforward. You block, parry and dodge, mixing light and heavy attacks until your foe's health bar is depleted. There are different weapons to complement different playstyles. If speed is your thing, smaller blades will deal faster blows in exchange for doing less damage per strike. Swords will allow you, your jack-of-all-trades playstyle, being able to deal a moderate amount of damage with moderate pace. Heavier weapons deal heavier damage per hit, but are much slower. Enemy AI is far less formatted to wait for you to finish killing their friends, so you need to be a bit more mindful of your surroundings and keep your opponents in view, as to not get stun-locked to death. And this is a good thing. Taking on multiple opponents, though in previous games with the flashy animations looked amazing, was a tad too easy and arguably got boring. I've got patience for experimentation with Assassin's Creed combat because I don't think they've ever truly nailed it, but entering a confrontation with multiple opponents with a mind for logistics and tactics is a good thing. While it shouldn't be too hard to take on multiple opponents, it should take at least some thought, and that's what Origins attempts to instill. And you also have other abilities unlocked through the skill graph to take into consideration. The Overpower ability is useful and allows you to deal huge damage really quickly, though still requires timing for effective deployment. It isn't hugely precise, it can still result in you stabbing an ally amidst a crowd of enemies, which is hilarious frankly, but that's where the manual lock-on comes in handy, though honestly sometimes it can get confused as to which target you're after, and as a result only works best one-on-one. Of course, there are ranged elements. You have tools such as bombs, including smoke bombs, that can be quickly dropped if you're getting overwhelmed, to allow yourself to either escape, should an opportunity to do so be present, or more likely merely reorient yourself by disorienting your immediate adversaries. You have 2 bow slots you can quickly switch between, with 4 bow types available in the game. Hunter bows are just bows. They're the most bow you can ever have, and I quite like them for this. Light bows are quick and deal less damage, but can be fired several times in rapid succession. And with the correct perks, successive hits start to tot up, increasing the damage they overall do. Warrior bows are just shotguns in bow form, and predator bows are basically sniper rifles. I tend to default to the hunter bow and light bow setup, and never felt a need to explore the other 2, but all 4 have their uses, so there's certainly a good bit of variety there. I'm actually the same with melee weapons. Origins gameplay isn't necessarily in depth enough to make me curious about these other features. I simply find what works for me and stick with it, and there's something to respect about that. But I will say each individual melee weapon type probably doesn't have enough kill animations. Now, you don't see kill animations very often, but they're always incredibly satisfying to witness. Typically they occur when finishing off the last enemy in a fight, which then restores you to no longer detected. I'd have liked if these animations found their way into the flow of combat a bit more, and beyond that I'd call for more variation, because aesthetic variety is just like its own satisfying reward. Now, I don't fall into the category of people who say Assassin's Creed is absolutely a stealth game. I mean, it is to a point, but summarising the Assassin's Creed gameplay loop by one mechanic misses the point. In fact, I'd argue Assassin's Creed Origins does more to be an actual stealth game than Assassin's Creed 1 did. That doesn't make it better, it's just far more traditional in how the stealth systems function. It's a challenge of patience where you remain hidden, you stay in bushes, you stay still for as long as it takes for a patrol to pass, and you pick your moments. Assassin's Creed has always toyed with the idea of your visibility not necessarily equating your detection. It's your behaviour, it's how you interact with the world around you that dictates whether you remain undetected or if you get spotted. Social stealth as a concept is founded on the idea that it's your very visibility that renders you invisible. It's the notion of being able to go anywhere provided you have plenty of confidence, a high-vis jacket and a stepladder. Hiding in plain sight is meant to come across as a psychological approach to stealth. The traditional tropes of stealth are reversed. Rather than being a challenge of patience, it's a challenge of pace. And while that's meant to be a fun system to play around with, the combat isn't intended to be a soft fail state. The triangle of core gameplay aspects for Assassin's Creed, being stealth, combat, and parkour, aren't meant to take prevalence over each other necessarily. I always view Assassin's Creed as a game where you use stealth, combat, and parkour in tandem to carry out your objective. Now, this triangle did get muddled as early as Assassin's Creed 2, so it probably has no bearing on Origins. But in the first game, or at least for huge chunks of it, no matter what you were doing, you had two other options. You could be fighting, you could be using social stealth, or you could indeed be using parkour. And at any given moment, you can go from one to another. This encourages experimentation as you challenge yourself in efficiency, and that's where we get to the bottom of what Assassin's Creed gameplay is meant to be all about. The constant overlapping of these systems to establish flow. Now that I've spoken about the parkour system's shortcomings, the more traditional stealth aspects in exchange for the social stealth being completely gone, and this new RPG-style combat that has its likeable qualities, but isn't necessarily something outstanding, even within the more confined realms of its own hitbox nature. What makes it a hard sell for me, with the Assassin's Creed title slapped on the box, is the fact this flow is somewhat truncated. Sure, you can try to escape a fight, use a bit of parkour to get away, but the parkour system is designed to climb things and overcome obstacles more than anything, so you can keep moving in a straight line. And you can go from stealth to combat, but you can't go from combat back to stealth because the moment you're detected, everybody seems to know where you are, rather than just those who have immediately sighted you. So because these systems aren't delivered to such a precise degree that they actually complement one another as such, the primary gameplay ultimately discourages experimentation. Rather, you'll find a technique that works and apply it to everything it works on. Stealth works great if you can't be bothered with combat, combat works if you can't be bothered with stealth, but there's no progression nor method to progression. Stun-locking boss fights is incredibly easy, though sometimes inconsistent for no reason. Firing arrows up an elephant's backside is incredibly reliable. Where the game stumbles is all of this being rather unfulfilling because you find a technique, and if it works, you don't really see a need to change it. That's great if you're speedrunning a Souls game, but the gameplay overall becoming muscle memory after a short few hours certainly robs Origins of intensity. Yes, there's enough to play around with for you to actually engage with it, but how the moment-to-moment gameplay collides isn't actually engaging, if that makes sense. You can competently carry out the loop while paying attention to other things, and it doesn't really provoke any real thinking, which is probably both its greatest drawback and most redeeming quality in one. It's a drawback because it doesn't provide any demand for mindful playing, and it's a redeeming quality because mindless fun can still be fun. Sure, no matter what you do, you can't avoid a game ultimately feeling somewhat repetitive by the end, and I'm not trying to make the argument that Origins contains the most mundane of gameplay loops I've ever seen. However, I do argue Origins' gameplay loop is disproportionately shallow when compared to how long you're going to spend in the game doing it. And that brings me to another thing. This game has more RPG-focused mechanics to contend with. You level up by gaining XP done by engaging in side content such as quests and tombs and merely killing enemies. I'm not trying to insult your intelligence, you obviously know how leveling up in games typically works. You unlock skill points both by finding tablets in tombs and by leveling up, and then invest them in perks to suit your playstyle. The level system dictates which areas you can visit and which you must avoid until you're of a level where a hyena won't wreck your day on sight. Higher level foes are marked by a red level icon above their heads, and if the disparity is bigger than that still, it will simply be a skull. Meaning you're almost guaranteed to die if you take this foe on head to head. This world-spanning leveling system locks off some areas until later on in the game and directs you towards lower level areas, gradually working your way up. I understand its necessity in an RPG to an extent, but the image of being a god of death in one area then being ripped to shreds by a medium-sized animal in the next is still quite awkward. The leveling system is just a leveling system in the end of the day. It clearly works in RPGs as RPGs keep using them, and it's no less competent than average here. Level gating is thrown askew by the fire lakes who roam huge portions of the map,
and are at levels often disproportionate to the regions you find them in. If you're in an area that suits your lower level and a fire lake rocks up, they may prove impossible to defeat, and since the game doesn't facilitate escape too much, it can be a bit of a chore to avoid being one hit or shot to death with arrows. I will say the leveling system doesn't, however, render taking on enemies significantly higher level than you a challenge as such. It's more akin to a system where you'll either be one hit before you can even say the word level, or you'll find the engagement to be no more engaging than any other fight in the game. Boss fights is an area AC Origins treats more as an exhibition. Enemies with long health bars and names to let you know they mean business just take a bit of dodging, blocking and slashing, and you can either get the hang of that or you don't. Nothing realistically proves too challenging here, at least not on normal difficulty. You can bump the game up to nightmare difficulty if you're looking for that challenge, but since outright upping the ante to the maximum degree has never really been my thing, I think what I'd like to say is challenge purely boils down to getting overwhelmed by enemies rather than one-on-one confrontations where anything realistically is possible. That being said, I wouldn't define Origins as anything close to grindy, so that does redeem what I don't like nor understand somewhat. Then there's the gear and loot system. It's a system, I suppose. You pick up weapons and shields and chests and things, and that allows you to keep swapping out what you're using for more items at your current level. You sometimes find gear higher than your present level, at which point some game logic non-existent force tells you cannot equip the item until you hit this arbitrary number, which annoys me even when such a problem crops up in games like The Witcher 3. But unlike The Witcher 3, I prefer how Origins handles clothing. Bayek's aesthetic is purely cosmetic. What garment you wish to don has no bearing. It's nice, really. Instead, you upgrade your armor and a bunch of other statistics through upgrading some gear you have. You can upgrade items such as swords, bows, and shields, and a blacksmith, or you could just wait until you inevitably find something better in a chest anyway. The loot needed for crafting is easy enough to come by, and from the menu you can dismantle all sorts of redundant items in your inventory to reinvest into upgrading your equipment, and I like that. Being able to upgrade / dismantle anything from just your menu isn't particularly immersive, but it's the thought that counts. I also like that in the menu you can toggle your hood up and down. Moreover, you can also toggle your hair and beard to either be long or shaved. And there's a cool story behind why. It's just those two choices, and that's because it was a debug tool in development that they forgot to remove. So instead of a hidden function, the devs updated it so it had a visible place on the menu. What a good choice. Bald-bearded Bayek is a god among men. To conclude my long-winded gameplay ramble, ultimately I think Origins' greatest gameplay flaw came from its placement within the Assassin's Creed franchise, in the sense that adding these RPG elements required such a simplification to account for the scope a role-playing game such as this demanded. The gameplay seems peeled back versus what came before to make way for the RPG elements that don't innately contradict the game exploring AC mechanics far deeper, but ultimately it's the depth in the Assassin's Creed mechanics that would prove to be a challenge in formatting for the purpose of a big role-playing game. Now, the gameplay isn't horrid, it's also just not great. It's like Ubisoft used Origins going forward as a baseline for how to construct their games overall, so I'm not too surprised to revisit Origins and find it has the hallmarks of many of the flaws I perceived in the later titles, but there's very little in the way of uniquely building upon the RPG element to suit Assassin's Creed, or vice versa, otherwise than superficially. There's certainly fun to be had here, but gameplay seldom breaks past second gear. There's the occasional set piece which is really nice, but that's it. Ultimately, Origins gameplay left a lot on the table, and I think the same can be said for Odyssey and Valhalla after it. Now, of course, the gameplay in such an open world game is nothing without the side content, and unfortunately the side content in this game is another mixed bag too, really. I mean, the world does do a lot of heavy lifting, but a lot of the side quests follow a very similar formula. There's enough variation and enough stories for them to at least be engaging from a basic perspective, and yet a lot of them still default to boring non-cutscene camera angles that are also invasive in the main story, but the reasoning for this is understandable. There's a whopping volume of dialogue in any game of this scope, so cut corners in a lot of the cutscenes is to be expected. It's true of The Witcher, Horizon, and any other game you can probably mention that suits the comparison parameters for this one. Origins doesn't bid to disguise it much, but it's something I twigged onto. Orbiting camera you can physically move while Bayek and a character or two stand talking while making vague hand gestures. I just don't quite get. It is what it is in the end of the day, and there are certainly bigger issues. The subject matter of a lot of quests boils down to a very similar layout. You end up in some variety of hideout or fort and are tasked with rescuing somebody or retrieving something, often carrying someone out of somewhere only to put them down and them to then stand up as if they were fine all along. Why? That being said, a lot of the quests genuinely do have more depth to them, are more interesting and follow suit with investigations and other curiosities. Some take you to interesting locations and take advantage of Origin's more interesting aspects, but there's no telling which do which, if that makes sense. So it's a coin toss as to whether you'll find yourself engaging with a fun bit of side storytelling, such as investigating the site where Bayek killed Rujek in the Bent Pyramid back at the start of the game, as somebody has since cleaned up the scene, so to speak, that actually enriches the core narrative, or you might just find yourself simply killing somebody in a fort, rescuing somebody who has a strange fetish for being carried out of danger but is otherwise perfectly okay, and it's an odd mixture, and thanks to having to level up, you're exposed to a lot of it. It has its moments where you can see the value in the setup, and there are moments where you yearn for the sweet release of the end of the game, as it doesn't always make sense to have to peel away from the main story to level up through side content, and in those moments it can get a bit invasive to have to do that. Nonetheless, the side quests are only one facet of content. We also have forts and hideouts. We don't have to clear them out altogether, thankfully. We just have to kill the leaders and loot all the treasure instead. I like that, as it's more open to stealth approaches, and even though the gameplay isn't necessarily the most receptive to stealth, like I said, it's viable, so it's nice that any objective entailing clearing out a fort also allows for stealth to be vaguely viable. There are, of course, animal dens where we have to kill a higher level animal than the rest, which is a great way to get resources for crafting, as is raiding forts really. The fire lakes are a cool idea, you get some interesting gear out of that, especially the outfit at the end of the whole ordeal, and their existence not only serves to be a consequence to the assassination of Gennadius in the main story, but is also intended to be a challenge for us to seek out. Except it's also seeking us out, and unless you're leveled appropriately, it puts you at a disadvantage, especially when these over-leveled juggernauts track you down while you're in the middle of something else. On the point of challenge, there are also elephant boss fights at various points on the map, including 2 elephants at once. Now, I don't have a thing for killing elephants, however, Assassin's Creed Origins clearly does. One of my favourite bits of content is, of course, plunging into tombs in search of easy skill points. It's nice that they have that. There are also pieces to read up on as you delve into the passages where nobody has set foot in possibly millennia. It's a great feeling more than it is anything more, but I really like that feeling. I like having to use my torch to illuminate a really dark room. I like that feature of it burning away cobwebs in passing. I like the puzzles, even if Ubisoft couldn't make them simpler if they tried. Beneath many ancient tombs, we can find even more ancient structures, Isu temples of some variety. With silica found in these tombs and places like them, we can activate these beacon things and hear messages from those who came before. Origins pays tribute to the warm, fuzzy mystery that Assassin's Creed once revelled in having, and I love that aspect to it. The element of discovery to this was spectacular to experience for the first time in 2017, and it hasn't really let up. Then there are things like the stone circles. You get these cool, easygoing puzzles while Bayek remembers conversations with his son in the background, and it really enriches his placement within the world and serves to expand upon the bond he shared with his son, if you don't solve the easy puzzle a bit too quickly, that is. Sometimes it can be hard to see where the piece you're looking for is, but once you clock it, it's as easy as anything. I also find it a bit weird that you can solve the puzzle long before the dialogue is finished, so you might miss a lot of that, especially if you're just sort of switching your brain off. The only advice to which I can give is just take your time. But you know what, I like doing these, and then as an icing on the cake, it's tied to a nice mystery at the Sphinx. And then there are, well, the Trials of the Gods, where you go into the desert and fight a giant god. I mean, it's there. You just shoot the giant god in the chest and dodge its attacks, fighting waves of minions as they crop up. I really don't see the point in this, but it was just an extra bit of content updated in after the game's release for those that like that aspect, so I shan't judge it too heavily from a position of preference for the brand it exists within, but I find the fact that its health bar begins spiralling down once you hit a certain point quite unsatisfying. But you do get some cool gear out of these late game fights if that's what you're after. Now, more so than any individual aspect of the side content, I think Origins taps into the atmosphere of its well constructed and delivered world, which brings out a layer to appreciate the content, even as a means to keep you in this world for just that bit longer. The side quests have their ups and downs, the checklisty world objectives are there if you want to do them, the tombs are a great immersive experience, the optional boss fights kind of exist, but have their value if that's your thing. There are bits of information to find in the world, things to read, places to see, quests to partake in, deserts to simply wander across. Origin's world is something to behold beyond its content, and that enriches the content it actually has. This is probably an argument I'd make for Valhalla to an extent too. The open world's very design, this fascinating period in time in a nation renowned for its mystery and mythology, is such a fascinating, beautiful thing, and the fun to be had exploring it extends beyond the sum of its actual activities. Nonetheless, side content is somewhat bumpy within itself, a mixed bag if you will, but it's worthwhile to soak in at least some of it. Not that the game gives you much of a choice. The compass will guide you to every noteworthy location with a question mark or something though, and the only thing you're not properly guided to would probably be things like Easter eggs. There's no way of telling there's a TARDIS in the River Nile unless you went and found it, or looked it up. Whale bones in the desert is cool, finding this bloody boat nearby to the pyramids nowhere near any body of water is fascinating. Stumbling upon the future site of Bayek's grave while playing as him is also incredible. Origins, like many decent open world games, thrive best when they provide you with little moments over massive pieces of content. That's not to excuse the shortcomings of those pieces of content, but at the very least I can say this is an open world with at least some mind for attention to detail. And it's those small details that make it such a fun world to get lost in. Now, I know this video's been long, to which I do apologise. Ultimately, Assassin's Creed Origins is a bumpy game. It has its lumps, its narrative holes, its moments of lackluster and so on, but when it shines, when it taps into its strengths, its gorgeous open world, its magnificent atmosphere, the music, Bayek, the tombs, the stone circles, the Isu temples, the very attention to detail in the world itself, it really does show you a game with value. The game's flaws are made bearable by the fact that the world convinces you to spend time in it. The setting is ridiculously compelling. Bayek's character is fantastic, even if that factor is mostly supplied by the impeccable acting of Abu Bakr Salim. There's truly a lot to like about Origins, or at least there's a lot you come away wanting to like more. The gameplay does drag it down a fair distance, which isn't ideal, what with being a game, but even that isn't as straightforward as being just plain bad. It doesn't go far enough one direction, but doesn't pull in the other direction to justify what it doesn't. Origins exists as a game that became an RPG to strike out from the building woes of the brand, to be a fresh start, to be a new era for the series, and while that potential wasn't something I think further installments realised nor cared to realise, as Ubisoft as a corporate entity were more interested in their digital storefronts and selling the consumer slop just because it's easy, the fundamental aspects of Origins comes up with aren't a bad basis for a game, even if it was never really right for Assassin's Creed as a series. It's such a strange title, one I have a lot of love for even now. I do wish it expanded more on some of its systems, had more going for it gameplay wise, more meat to its plot, especially towards the back end of the narrative and all of that. But most of all, I just wished for more reasons to linger in this recreation of an ancient Egyptian world. More scenery to soak in, more hallucinations to experience, more music to listen to, something the DLCs then went on to supply to a degree. So, to answer the key question, is Origins a good game? Yes. Is it a perfect game? No. However, it's certainly far from anything close to truly bad, at least from my perspective. It's been fun revisiting it, remembering the experiences I've had with it, taking on a new perspective now that I've had so much time to not think about Assassin's Creed as an overall brand and just appreciate the game for what it is, and acknowledging the Assassin's Creed element in passing. Do I still have my grievances? Sure, but they don't dominate every thought anymore. This is a game I can enjoy and I'm content with that. Oh wait, I forgot to talk about the modern day.
Does the name William Miles ring a bell?
Oh well. Thank you for putting up with my insane ramblings for however long this video's been. I'll see you soon.